On this episode of Still Loading, Daniel Greenberg. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today on the show, we have a video game design professor and also a YouTuber. Daniel Greenberg is on the podcast. Daniel, how are you doing today?
Doing all right. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for agreeing to come onto the show. I've been really looking forward to speaking with you because I've said it numerous times on the podcast. I went to school for game design, and now that I can actually get a professor on, it's kind of I kind of want to know a little bit more about the thought process of like what it's like to be a teacher teaching video games and video game design at a college or at a university. And you teach at George Mason University, correct?
Yeah, so I'm with George Mason University's School of Computer Game Design. We're housed in the College of Visual and Performing Arts at George Mason, which means our degree is an arts degree. So it's a Bachelor's of Art or Master's of Art. I've been affiliated with George Mason since about 1999 when I went as a non-degree seeking student. My two bachelor's degrees and my master's degree are all from there.
Okay.
And we started the game design program roughly 15 years ago now.
Okay.
We have it. We are a little bit distinct in that there's a separate computer science with a focus in game development that comes through the computer science department, which is where I got my degree. But when I came back for the master's, I went on the art side of things, and I teach on the art side of things now.
Okay. And so the art side of things would that would obviously be the 3D and the actual art stuff that goes into games, but also the design elements, I'd assume as well,
Yeah,
correct?
that's actually the class I made and probably spend the most time teaching is our basic game design course, which is largely focused on theory and basic design principles. Students get used to writing documentation, producing game pitches, presentations, making rule sets. They get some practice in experimenting with making board games or making simple video games, and a chance to sort of explore the process of that's whether it's iterative design, getting a little bit of experience into software development and some of the language behind that, but also really just the principle of making games.
All right. And but before we kind of dive in more to your work as a professor, I want the listeners to get to know you a little bit better. So what's your background in gaming in general? What first got you into video games, and what are some of your gaming memories leading up to today?
Sure. So I was the younger of two sons in my family. My brother was 8 years older than me. So when I showed
Oh,
up
wow.
so when I showed up in 1984, we had some really cool late 70s and early 80s tech already kind of in the house, in the form of an Atari 2600 and a Commodore 64.
Mhm.
And by the time I was old enough to pull myself up into the chair in his room and figure out how to type Lodestar 81 into that thing, I was firing away, playing any and all of the definitely 100% legitimate and not at all copied 5 1/4 floppy disks that we had. Things ranging from Bionic Commando to Test Drive. And then with the 2600, I was, by then the Atari 2600 was long past its prime, right? The thing had been out forever. We had already gone through the North American console game crash of '83, a year before I was born, which meant when I showed up, you could get 2600 games really cheap. So, my family wasn't terribly wealthy, but we could definitely afford to get, two games for $1 from the bin at, the local store. So I could find copies of even
God,
like
that sounds
really high
awesome.
quality Activision games, River Raid, Pitfall,
Yeah.
Kaboom, So it's really stuff that still holds up today. I could get that, for pennies on the dollar. And, I kind of grew up playing some really great stuff. And then, from there, since I expressed an interest in it, the family, kind of said, well, okay, we're not buying him action figures. We're not buying him, rocking horse or a toy gun or whatever. He seems to be into the things that glow and beep.
You won't
So
shoot your eye out. Yeah.
yeah, so then it was on to, NES and everything from there, and it kind of stuck with me. Now, getting into games and working in games very different. So I will
Yes.
say that while I definitely grew up playing games, I didn't really grow up wanting to make them, or certainly didn't grow up thinking I'm going to teach people how to make them.
Hmm.
That kind of came many years later. I had an affinity for programming, and it was something I did as a hobby growing up. And so I always assumed I would be a programmer. When I went to George Mason and started working on my programming degree, I was in the computer labs late at night, like 8, 9, 10 at night.
Okay.
And I was working on, something complicated but kind of boring, like making an operating system from scratch or building complex data structures. We had a really great class at Mason that was about bomb defusal, that you
Hmm.
actually had to take a program and run it through a debugger in assembly and try to interpret what passwords were in the program. And if you didn't get, if you guessed wrong or couldn't, stop the program from running, it would explode and send a message to the class saying like, "Hey, deduct 10 points from this person's grade because they blew up a bomb." So it was kind of a neat high pressure class, but
It's an
literal and
interesting way
figurative
to
trial by
teach.
fire. Yeah, not the most interesting one I have. I'll tell you later. I have a really funny story about an acoustic engineer that I knew who had a final that involved taking a ship apart. But
Whoa.
the back to the lab, I was working on, complicated but boring stuff. And there's like three or four other students in there who are all working on games. And they were very talented, but, the programming stuff didn't always stick with them because they were mostly, art students. And so
Hmm.
I would help them debug some programming stuff, go back to my work, help them debug some of their programming stuff, go back to my work. And after doing that about like four times, they have much better homework than I do. So, at the end of that semester, I went and I changed my concentration from a computer science degree to a computer science degree with a focus in game design. And all of a sudden, I found myself way more interested in doing my homework, because
Hmm.
then I was working on like capstone projects, making a multiplayer online tank game and learning about remote procedure calls and how to build online lobbies and, all the stuff that goes into that. It was, not that the technical stuff like the operating system code wasn't fun to do, but it's different, when you can actually play the tangible results of your work. There's a weirdly rewarding vibe you get from that.
I would assume playing an operating system isn't the best reward. I mean, it'd be rewarding to be get it to work, but it's not like you're going to have fun with the reward, if that makes
Right.
sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so then you started getting it. You started focusing on game design from there, and how did that transition then to you eventually becoming a professor? Was it just a gradual? Did you know you wanted to be a professor at that point, or was it something you kind
I
of
did a
fell
little
into?
bit. In 2008, my mother's father was in poor health and he was going into hospice care. And he was a World War II vet. He went to Iwo Jima,
Oh wow,
and and like he didn't really feel comfortable talking about the war until maybe
I I
the
can
90s,
understand why
maybe.
there's some
Sure.
messed up stuff that happened.
Yeah, and but he would go and he would talk to the students at Old Dominion, and he would give lectures to them about his experiences. And he told me later in life that he always wanted to be a teacher, but it wasn't something he was able to do. When he came back from the war, he worked on the railroads. He was a conductor on Amtrak. He actually worked the same Northeast Corridor line that Biden would take every day from Delaware to DC.
Oh, okay.
But so he passed in 2009, and part of me thought, I don't do a lot of teaching necessarily. I'd volunteered at like summer camps to teach kids Java or,
Yeah.
you know, I knew I liked academia because I really enjoyed being in school. And I kind of rediscovered myself going from being, a janitor to a college student. Because I'd kind of written my education off. I dropped out of high school and took up a job, um, literally cleaning toilets. So when I started going kind of up the academic ladder, bachelor's degree, master's degree. By then I kind of figured, all right, I gained enough confidence that this is a thing I could do. So I tried my hand at it as a GTA for a semester,
Okay.
and that went well enough that I did it for a second semester. And The second semester was the semester I submitted my master's thesis and graduated. And they then extended me an offer to continue on as an adjunct professor because the whole time I'm doing this, I'm also working a full time day job. But I have been doing that now for 5 years ish,
Okay.
and I've just stuck with it ever since.
That's awesome. I can kind of relate to that because I like it. There's something really fun. I don't think I would ever become a teacher just mainly because uh I wouldn't have the dedication to go through all the schooling required to become one. But the when you teach someone and you can see someone understand what you're talking about and get the lesson, that's one of the my favorite things to see. Even though like when I'm talking about what I teach, I used to be a trainer, and when my at my job, and when I would train new hires and get them like onboarded onto the system and like teach them the process and everything, it was one of the most rewarding things to see them actually understand what I was talking about and not just having it kind of glaze over their eyes, glaze over, and it go over their heads.
Yeah.
So I can understand why you kind of were drawn to that because I don't know, it's rewarding for you too. Maybe I'm just putting words in your mouth, but at least that's how it was for me. Okay, so let's talk about being a game design professor. So, what's your official title at George Mason?
So my official title is adjunct professor of computer game design.
Okay. So, a couple questions regarding that. One, I was thinking about this. Are there any, like, have you experienced any, like, negative preconceptions that other professors have of video games because you're a video game design professor? I know you're kind of in an area of the university, like you said before, that is more geared towards computers, but have you ever had an experience like that?
Not much. I would say there's a you recognize sort of in the larger academic space that you're fighting for validity, because we're
Hmm.
in the same college as art and music and film and video studies. And there's sort of that challenge to, especially with the old guard, give an understanding that video games are just another medium. Because
Hmm.
with the interactivity and the sheer size of gaming, I mean, gaming now is bigger than sports, it's bigger than music, it's bigger than television. It's the single highest grossing form of entertainment we have today. But that's one thing, right? Being popular and making a lot of money doesn't necessarily make something art. And the good news is, I think we're maybe 5 to 10 years kind of past the famous argument of are games art. I think the question we're at now is more of what is the language? What are the tools that we use? One of the things I explicitly study at George Mason is transmediation. It was the topic of my thesis, and it's something that I've been digging into pretty heavily in my years of study. The
Okay.
idea that you can move something from one form of art to another. And in the process
Okay.
of transmediation, so when you think about like the movie based on the book,
Yeah.
or God help us, the movie based on the video game,
Yeah. Mortal
because
Kombat just came out like
every
yesterday.
video game auteur, always when they interviews, they're like, I was inspired by so and so movie, or I see myself like a director. Um, there's sort of a cliche that all video game, minds, most of them anyway, want to be film people, but just make video games instead. Certainly, the AAA game space is kind of very heavily
Very
inspired
much
by that,
so
right?
like that. And
Um,
some of them are pulling it off better than others. I would say this isn't to throw shade at anybody, but
no, no,
Naughty
no,
Dog does a really good job of blending those two.
yeah, but the value in that concept comes from understanding that a lot of the tools that these different forms use, there are similarities there, right? And so if you understand that both have the ability to use, like, look at Mass Effect conversations and their use of rule of thirds, like very clear, set stage setting for conversations to try to build angles and set scenes.
Mhm.
The way that older RPGs had to use text and sort of the experiential narrative of how the reader perceives the room they're in. What does a GRU look like to one person playing versus another person playing?
Yeah.
So games have these similar tools. And when you just think of them as different forms of media, it becomes easier to understand games as art, right? We can always imagine low art and high art in other works, right? There's
Yes.
summer blockbusters, there's art house films, there's dime store novels, there's, the classics, from the great writers of antiquity.
Hmm.
There are, modern club remixes, there are orchestral movements. It's completely normal in these other fields to have things that you can kind of, even if you're not putting them into convenient buckets of things, but this perception as that type of art can span different categories of consumer. You have people who are high-minded about things. You can explore the depth and nuance of it. And I think what we're getting to slowly with games is understanding that they're really no different, right? A game, even though it has the interactivity and just the sheer experience of the person performing play, changes the overall experience. Um, we have that in theater too. You can take the script to any play, right? If you want to say put on a performance of Noises Off, right? You
Hmm.
can have a cast doing that at a local community theater. You can have a cast doing that, on Broadway. You can have people performing that work on Zoom now, and they're all the same experience performed differently, which in some ways isn't entirely different than watching
You're,
five different Twitch players all play the same game, but play it at different skill levels with
yeah,
different intentions, or different narrative, the way
it's a
that they
very good
wrap
point.
commentary around play. It's all transformative, and you get completely different experiences out of the same source material.
I never thought of how similar games are in terms of the interactive element to plays. Just you're right, because every time, even if it's the same people performing the play, multiple shows, it's going to be slightly different each time. Just like the same person playing a game multiple times, it's going to be slightly different each time.
This gets a little bit, no plug intended, really. My thesis was entitled Brava Celis, and it was an exploration of the Dream Oath opera from Final Fantasy VI and comparing it to actual, say, like late era Italian opera,
Okay.
and all of the different mechanisms they use. The leitmotif and the buffo, and sort of the similarities in the arias, the parallels of Sella Cher versus like um, Maria Callas's performances, and kind of identifying a lot of those parallels, just to show that um, games and something that people kind of view as high, like very high on the totem pole of art.
Yeah.
Like opera has this revered position in it. But one of my favorite weird coincidences is that maybe one of the last great like classical opera composers, Benjamin Britten, passes away right when Will Crowther's Adventure comes out for computers, like that
Okay.
same mid 70s period, right? And there's just kind of this weird ship in the night thing that's happening where games are just starting to explore narrative right when opera's like maybe one of its last storied composers is passing away. And so how do games and opera, where are those parallels? If you can find those, if you can point out that, hey, in classic early Final Fantasies and other RPGs, they basically have to use surtitles because, in an opera, if it's in a language you don't understand, you're reading the text above or below the stage as you're watching the performance is really no different than a dialogue box in a game.
Yeah.
You're sitting far away from the characters. So if you think about more modern RPGs or adventure games, they can get really close in on the character. You can see small facial expressions. You can communicate emotions differently. Think about like the early RPGs, right? You would have when a character surprised, the sprite would, all four
It
arms
has to
go
be
out
super
wide, right?
exaggerated.
You
Yeah.
have to exaggerate because of the distance between the viewer and the character. They do that in stage performance. You have to exaggerate because you cannot use subtle expressive differences in like the face,
Because you have
because
to
you can't have the
perform to
whole
the back
audience
of the
piled up
audience.
in the
Yeah.
front row.
Exactly. That that's that's interesting. One of the things that I've always loved about games is just like what you've been talking about, is like where the other forms of media intersect with it. And also even like if you look at the trajectory of like how game design is progressing, because the in like the 70s in film, right, you had a bunch of film nerds become filmmakers. George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, all those guys. And so they studied the old films, which are much more representative, I would say, of like theater, because that's what it was, the closest thing at the time. And so now they were able to refine it. And I kind of feel like we're kind of getting to a similar era right now. Because if you look at a lot of indie games, they're looking at what made the old NES games super popular. And they're finding ways to refine it to make it better for modern audiences. Look at games like Shovel Knight and The Witcher,
Hmm.
not The Witcher. I'm sorry, The
Messenger.
Messenger. The
Yeah.
Messenger. Yeah, you knew exactly what I was thinking. Shovel Knight, The Messenger. Even like things like I haven't played it yet, but Undertale, they're these game nerds who loved these games growing up, and they're like, let's try to find a way to make this more modern. Let's really dive into 2D design and see what we can fix from the old games. Because a lot of cinema had for or not cinema, sorry, a lot of game like AAA studios don't do 2D game design. So now these new up and comers are like, let's refine what came before us, type of thing. And it kind of it's reminiscent, at least to me, of like what happened in the 70s in film, where a lot of like 60s and 70s, where a lot of these film nerds decided to get their hands on a camera and really refine cinema from what they knew it to be.
Hmm.
Would you agree with that idea, or do you think I'm a little off with that? I'm just more less curious on your opinion.
No, it's largely. I don't know if they're necessarily motivated. Every designer is going to come into and approach something differently, right? They're not all necessarily motivated by correcting the past or identifying I think
Maybe
iterative
correcting the
design
past
just
wasn't the right term,
well,
but
sorry. I think just what you're kind of getting at is there's this natural thing that occurs from iterative design where we know what's come before. And if you're not trying to make a copy of what's come before, how do you differ it? How does it change? Not all games especially not all super successful games are entirely unique. Um, Galaxian was just basically Space Invaders with a color palette, and then Galaga was just the sequel to Galaxian with some slight changes to it. But those little iterative steps, by the time you got to Galaga, was that was an inspired
massive.
game.
Yeah.
That is still you go to a pizza place and find a Galaga machine, you're going to try to find, if you can, a quarter, right? Somehow,
Hmm.
some way. It doesn't always have to be that one mechanic or that one concept that nobody necessarily thought of before for play. One of my favorite designers out there right now is Terry Kavanagh,
Okay.
because the last three or four things I've played from him, I wouldn't say any of them that I've played were mind blowing concepts that no one had come up with before. VVV was just a Commodore inspired platformer with a gravity flip mechanic that he does a great job of picking his composers. He had Magnus Paulsen do that. He had Chip Zell come on for his next two games after that. So,
Hmm.
he picks great musicians to pair with. But it was just a very tight, simple execution of something where I think he understood the relationship between how many iterations of a level you can make and how quickly you allow players to play and replay a level so that they don't get frustrated by difficulty, right? If
Hmm.
you have checkpoints in literally like every second or third room of a game, you don't care if you die 5 or 10 times per room because you're not going back to the
You're
start of the
not
level.
losing
You're
a
not
lot of
you're not
progress.
losing that progress, right? Um, it's the argument between Ninja Gaiden 1, 2, and 3. The difficulty of the games and how much of the progress gets lost or how far back you go when you lose. Is Ninja Gaiden 3 harder because there's no continues and you have to go all the way back to the beginning? Um, or is it the increased difficulty of the particular spawning of enemies in one? There's those little nuances and differences. But I think Terry really understood that the frustration in the game came from repeating things you'd proven you can do correctly. I mean, that's really why we put checkpoints in games. Is once you're comfortable with what the player has proven up to this point, don't ask them to do it again. Now put them through the next thing that you want to challenge them to. And he paces them so well that even in rooms like I think it's Veni Vidi Vici is the incredibly complicated, like all the way to the ceiling, all the way to the floor, like 6 or 7 room traversal in
Hmm.
that game. You get enough cracks at it fast enough that you're just the process of learning in the game loses the frustration factor.
I That's my favorite kind of. those the games that do that are my favorite because, like you said, you don't want to, uh, especially. I think a lot of it also. I mean, I've had this. I shouldn't say theory, but this idea that like one of the reasons why game design has progressed like that is also because as adults we have less time, so we don't want to waste our time going through stuff we've all like you mentioned before we've already proven we can do. And I feel like especially as the gaming age has increased, time is so much more valuable, so that's one, like quality of life improvements are such an important factor, especially for when you're rebooting something or you're remastering something.
And that's also definitely an age and marketing thing, right? Are you trying
Yeah.
to sell this game to 10-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and how much time you're expecting of each of those individual groups?
I remember learning in my game design course a lot of it, like trying to design something to respect the gamer's time, to respect their efforts, so that way you're not wasting it. I remember that phrase very clearly from my professor: respect the gamer's time, type of thing. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of trailing off here, but I thought that's
No,
some really interesting points.
actually thinking about the person on the other side of the controller is something we stress over and over again. Everything from the ethics of consumption and how much money you're pulling from them and how you're pulling that money and from what people, you know, time. The sort of the big debate now, right, is when games get too close to gaming, which I more the gambling side of things.
Yes.
There's lots of talk about how to make games. But I think something that I'm glad that we bring into the curriculum is we have ethics courses. We actually, like you would any other form of media, understanding the power of authorship and sort of, with power comes responsibility, understanding what the consequences of your creative actions could be. Because if you want games to be art has, for as long as art has been around, been a motivator. Art can lead, art can inspire, art can teach, art can mobilize. It is something that almost inherently carries message. So yay, we've proven games are art. That does mean there's an extra sort of weight of ethics that comes with that.
Yeah, what
And
message are we sending now?
right, messaging, and also the power of compulsion and what kind of play are you getting.
Mhm, mhm. And I remember for ages ago, you were talking earlier in the episode about our games art, and I would even say, like, the conversation pretty early on shifted, are they considered high art versus, like, because art on a basic definition, video games from their conception, it should never have even been a debate, but when, like you were saying, is it considered opera? Is it considered a Monet? You know what I'm talking about? Like, is it something? And I do think there are some games out there that you could consider to that level, but it it's just going to take time before a lot of the old guard dies out, which is really pessimistic and awful to say, but
I,
I
I
mean that's
mean,
the
I
reality
don't
of it.
know. I don't know how you get through a first playthrough a journey without crying. I
So,
mean, I'm
thank you. That's literally I interviewed Austin Wintory because of that game. That game is one of the best games I've ever played in my life. I told a story on my podcast a while ago. I remember seeing a meme of some guy was saying how his girlfriend, who doesn't really play games, was playing Journey, and she was with some player. And for those who don't haven't played Journey, the multiplayer element of it is that you don't speak to this person, you don't know their screen handle, you don't know their name, you can't talk to them in any way, shape, or form, text or otherwise. Maybe Morse code if you really wanted to take the time, but you they she spent the entire playthrough, the whole 2 hour playthrough, with this same person, and the person was super patient, and it was someone who clearly had a lot of experience, because that cool thing in Journey where, like, your cape gets more like
right. The
intricate,
length of, yeah.
the for the or sorry, your like gown or whatever gets more intricate the more times you beat the game. And they played through the whole game with it. They taught her. They had this really emotional journey, and this whoever this random person was patient with her and stuck with her the whole way. And at the end of the playthrough, you could see the message. He messaged her on PSN, and it was something to the effect of, "It was an honor to walk, live, and die by your side," or something like that. And it was like, you can't have that in other media, or not quite. I mean, maybe you could, but not quite as easily accessible.
Yeah. It's the camaraderie from experiences like that. And I've
Yes.
I've played in I was very briefly on like a professional Rainbow Six team.
Okay.
I have played. I'm a big hockey guy, so I've played college hockey, and it's that camaraderie is hard to find outside of the competitive scene with the same level of emotional attachment, but without the competitiveness to it. Like that's not an
That's a
easy thing
good
to pull
point.
off.
Yeah. It's a very good point. I didn't think about that. And games really do that. Why do you think there's video game conventions? Like,
I I don't know, but man, I miss them.
I do too, man. I always consider I've said this before, and I don't go into it in a lot of detail because it understandably can turn people off. I'm actually religious, and I consider video game conventions like the church of the video game fan. You know, like this is where you commune with quote unquote fellow believers to talk about something that you genuinely love, and it's a really it's a great thing. And like I miss conventions so much.
Yeah. I that was another thing that kind of came out of being an academic in the game space is I discovered the convention scene by giving academic lectures at conventions. That I my local convention is MagFest,
Yeah, I've
but
never been.
the
I've wanted to so bad though.
yeah, it's an experience, and it sounds like they've got their S together. So
Yeah, after
hopefully,
the
and
mess they had.
yeah, so hopefully they'll be up and running again by next year. It was actually I think too many games in
That's mine.
Philadelphia, right? That gave me my first chance. They gave a guys like, hey, can I do a talk on video games and opera? And they were willing to take the chance on me, and it was my first convention out there, and that went really, really well. And I've been doing those talks for years now. I've gone out to Retro World Expo, Gamer Grace out in Chicago, Portland Retro Gaming Expo, Too Many Games, Magfest, and that's something where you get the opportunity to talk to people face to face. Um, it's very, very hard to reproduce that. And
Mhm.
I've been doing YouTube stuff for years, and there's nothing I can do. And I'm a very amateur film person. There's not a lot I can do short of take the footage of the games I'm playing, or stitch some very basic stuff together for a review. But there's very little I can do there compared to the opportunity to just distill an argument into 45 minutes of well conceived slides and discussion, and then open it up to the floor, because it really does, just the sense of everyone being there and kind of having that communal motivation to learn, it
Mhm.
makes all the difference.
And I think I've seen a push, especially in the last like 3 or 4 years on YouTube of YouTubers and just online content creators in general really pushing for a concerted effort to not only to learn about video game history and preservation, but also to learn about why a game is well designed, or why is this game good, and really diving into it. I remember seeing a couple of years ago a video really breaking down Super Metroid and talking about like how well designed that game is, and how they incentivize you by giving you interesting things to look at, to be like, okay, I can't do this now. I'm going to come once I get this power up. Now I know, like you automatically think like, oh, that door
Right.
that was up too high, I now have a super jump. I can reach that door
Yeah.
back in this area.
Forecasting and telegraphing. Yeah.
Exactly.
The idea that you can present to the player, hey, here's a thing. You're going to want this, don't you? Come back here in, a few hours once you've
Hmm.
discovered the thing. And yeah, just planting those little seeds. That's a genre staple there. But
Of
they definitely get a
Metroidvanias,
lot of
yeah.
credit in establishing that.
But it's stuff like that where like you're seeing that more and more on YouTube and podcasts and Twitch, and all a bunch of avenues of content creation, of people really dissecting games and treating them as the high art form that they are. And actually, this is not the best segue, but just thinking about like with people becoming more interested in game design for your students, one of the questions I had for you is: are there any or is there a common misconception that you see with your students when you're teaching them, especially the beginner courses, when you're showing them the ropes of game design? Are there any common misconceptions that you see them all have, or a lot of them have?
Um, I would say when it comes to the industry, not so much. I think things are well publicized now. I think students understand They may not get all the concepts of day-to-day operations. We have to explain to them how scrums and sprints and the agile methodology and what certain working in the business of making software and some of that stuff that doesn't necessarily come across in articles about games. But I think they have a pretty good understanding coming to the major now about what to expect in the real world, and that was something that earlier on you had to do more teaching. Now I think it's pretty well publicized that there's a pretty good sense from students about what they're trying to get themselves into. I think where we have to break a lot of expectations for students is understanding that, like any other skill, this is a 10,000 hours to mastery thing that they're going to have to really kind of work at their craft. Every student, not every student, okay, just about every student comes into the game design program because they want to make games. And just about everyone that wants to make games has a golden baby. They have that one game that they can imagine it, they can picture it. It's a combination of their two or three favorite games ever, and it's going to be the best thing they have ever made. And for the longest time, that was a real source of inertia for a lot of students, because if you have this idea for this amazing thing you want to make, but your skill level won't allow you to make it, you're too afraid to make it, so you're paralyzed with sort of that fear of making this thing.
Hmm.
So you either start to make it, don't like the result and give up, or you just never make it in the first place. And so the two avenues I like to give my students, or to try to work them through this, is you can either accept that what you're going to make now may not necessarily meet those expectations, but try the best you can, iterate, and we can keep building this up over time, and you can see the improvement, and maybe that'll motivate you. But I have to credit James Cameron with the second option, and this is sort of the avatar solution, which is to
Okay.
say, you carefully bubble wrap your favorite idea, put it up on the shelf, and come back to it in 20 years, right?
Okay.
Because I think he said he wrote Avatar in high school.
Oh, wow.
And when I read the precious metal on the planet is unobtainium, I believe him. Um, but he made Terminator films and Titanic and all this amazing stuff, and he built himself up as this is this really accomplished director of all these. And then when the technology had caught up to him and he had the financial wherewithal to do this, and sort of the stars aligned and he thought he could make his vision a reality, then he came back and tackled it. He wasn't afraid to do all sorts of other things first, because he was willing to, he could protect the golden baby. He wasn't forced to give it all his attention.
Yeah.
And because he had the ability to kind of separate that and understand, like, hey, I'm a director, I got to make movies, this is what I'm going to do, that gave him, I think, the freedom that a lot of students struggle to initially find. So
I remember one of the things that so when I started in my game design courses, the big thing was MMOs. That was like the hottest, a couple years later it was FPSs with Call of Duty, but at that time it was World of Warcraft, Guild Wars, the
mhm,
big MMOs. So every kid came in, not me, because I didn't know what I wanted to make. I actually didn't have like something in mind. I think maybe an FPS, just because I thought that would be simpler, quote unquote. I use that
sure.
very loosely. But like everyone wanted to make an MMO, and I'm just kind of like, that's a lot. Like
Yeah,
that.
we don't get that as much now. Full disclosure, if you added up all the time that I was logged into World of Warcraft, I'm pretty sure it would top 1,000 days of human real world time. I learned a lot of great lessons about encounter design from World of Warcraft, and I'd like to think that my D&D table is the lucky recipient of all of those design
Are
things,
you the
because
DM?
it's all about not just telegraphing, a la like a Mike Tyson's Punch Out, where you can kind of sense what's coming and learn the rhythm.
Hmm.
We have this concept of dancing with bosses, the understanding, like you sort of start to slowly learn what the mechanics are and the movement and the pattern that needs to be followed to kind of defeat this opponent. And that's something fun to try to integrate into like a tabletop format. But MMORPGs are so large, right? There's this sense of grand scale, and a student comes to you with an MMO plan. It's like, okay, well, which data center are you going to be working with, and how large a contract are you going to be striking up with that data center? What do you think how much input are you expecting? How many tens of thousands of dollars a month are you going to be paying for your virtualized services? You can probably do stuff through AWS now at a slightly smaller scale if like you think your player base is only going to be in the thousands, but still you're talking about huge financial
Well,
injection to,
even
to try to
even
make
just take
this.
out the finances. Like if you're talking about like new like kids just learning game design and stuff like that,
Mhm.
the just the technical know-how for the networking ability, right? Just to be able to connect that many people together, and then you add also being able to create a design and experience for thousands of people that
Right.
will and be interacting with each other constantly, and you have thousands of interactions every second. Oh, and
Now,
now wow, it's millions of
yeah.
billions of interactions
Now,
every
to be
second.
fair, there are massively multiplayer experiences that are not RPGs, that go back all the way
That's
back to
true.
think like Subspace Continuum in the 90s. That was
I don't
basically
even think I heard
massively
that one.
multiplayer online asteroids.
Okay.
That was, I think, Virgin developed that or produced it. But Subspace was a brilliant game. There were a variety of different ships. I think it was originally called Sniper, like for the first version or two, then Subspace for a long time.
Came out in 97, I see.
Okay, yeah, and then they eventually rebranded it as Continuum, and now I think it's called Subspace Continuum or something. But it's
Okay.
online, massively multiplayer online. It has that inertia style movement. If you were playing something like Asteroids, the ships feel like they
Gotcha.
move the same
Yeah.
way. It's got a variety of ships to play as. It's got, guns and
Interesting.
missiles, and very creative people in the space made subspace hockey, trench wars, all sorts of different games on servers you connect to, but there's still servers you connect to with hundreds of people playing.
Okay.
So if you are aware enough a code writer to minimize the amount of traffic across your network, right? Understanding that every local player is going to be resolving like any of the trigonometric operations. You want that done locally. You don't want to try to fire that over the network. Your remote procedure calls should be simple things like tell this ship on everybody's console that it just shot, or hey, do a quick polling to see did this ship get hit? Okay, kill it or apply damage.
Yeah.
If you can keep that to that chatter to a minimum through RPCs, and then everything else is just local, um, then yeah, I mean you can do massively multiplayer experiences even on relatively simple style games. Yeah, I think the IO games are a great proof of concept of this. Right? There's I forget which one was the original, but there's, Slither IO, Agar IO. There's a million of these IO games,
Mhm.
and they're all browser-based games that kind of work on the same concept: is limited space, massively multiplayer, grow, consume, die, repeat. But
Okay.
they come in a variety of flavors too. So you do see the MMO thing explored in a lot of places beyond something like a World of Warcraft clone. Obviously, that is so far beyond the scale of
Yeah, well,
college level game design. But
that's what people were coming with though. People were trying to make not necessarily a scale of WoW, but there was kids coming in through my program that was like what they wanted to do.
mhm,
The other thing I remember my teacher it was funny was, you know, one you have to stop playing games and start making them. You play games to learn about design, but you also have to stop doing that so you can actually, spend your time making games. And you might get a kick out of this. I remember one kid, I've told the story before on the podcast, but he no lie with a straight face and he was dead serious. Was like, well, no, I need at least 60 hours of JRPGs a week to function. And I'm thinking, how do you live? Like, do you have a job? How do you, I can't understand. Do you sleep? What is your life? One of
yeah.
the
Well,
strangest responses.
I mean, life is all about budgeting, right? You have
Hmm.
to decide how much you can spend on something, and that goes for money, that goes for time, that goes for mental wealth and health. There's a lot of cost benefit analysis that goes into that stuff, and when it comes to wanting to be a game developer, you have to start modifying that
Budgeting.
calculus a little bit. Yeah.
The entire month of May here on Still Loading has been sponsored by Geek Guilt. Geek Guilt is the go-to shop for all of your geeky needs. You know I'm a retro gamer, and I personally love their selection of NES games. And right now, they have a deal going on, where if you buy a pair of headphones and a mod mic, you will get a discount on both of them. So go to geekguilt.com and check out everything they have to offer. To transition away from game design and your work as a video game design professor, I want to talk about your work at Winterian Game Studios, which is your YouTube channel, correct?
Yeah, so we always have a great joke about this. Is it Winterian? Is it Winter Ion? Um, and I actually got a bunch of friends to cut a little like intro video for it that we used, I think, for our season 4 recap, kind of
Mm-hmm.
joking about how to pronounce the channel name. That actually started partially at George Mason University because I bought a lot of video equipment, microphones, and capture cards, and all these tools to record and capture classic games. I went out and got a FrameMeister. This was kind of in
Oh,
the early days. This was
probably when
the
it was a
early
little bit
days
cheaper
of
too.
trying to capture as authentic a thing as I could. I went and got an Adobe Creative Cloud subscription. And this was all originally done with the intention of making short videos for the students. And I still have made a bunch of videos for students, but I was doing it for independent design study credit. And my department said, "Oh, wonderful, perfect. We'll absolutely give you credit for that." Maybe like 6 weeks after that, the administration over the department's head said, "No, we can't actually give you independent study credit for that, and we're not going to, give you any expensing for any of the equipment you bought, and you just congrats, you have all this stuff." And I had already broken everything open and tested and used it, so I wasn't going to return it all for pennies on the dollar.
Yeah.
So I basically had built a recording studio, and this is back, I was in Clifton, Virginia, in those days, and I'm talking to my friends who are my fellow members of WGS, and saying, "Well, what do I do with this stuff?" And the consensus kind of was like, "Well, why don't we try making Let's Plays?" And because I am the oldest person in existence, as far as my brain will tell me, I responded with, "Well, what's a Let's Play?"
Okay. Okay.
And there was sort of a period of kind of learning and understanding how they exist as sort of transformative performances to demonstrate the experience of playing the game while also showing it off. And it was sort of this intriguing period where I was definitely way too late to this, and I completely understand that.
I was
My
the
old
same
my
too.
old roommate in college was on, he was in SA for years, and so like I kind of tangentially sort of understood that they would talk about games and show them off, and their formatting was a little different than kind of what caught on YouTube. And then there was sort of that, I guess, that great wave of people inspired by popular Let's Players on YouTube. And I remember in the early years of going to conventions that they were like highlights. And still to this day, some conventions are definitely driven, I think, in part by, the personalities that are there. But as it's transitioned to Twitch, and because everything is constantly in flux, whatever is coming after Twitch, um, it's definitely, we're sort of building, I guess it's not modern, it's already gone to like contemporary in terms of Let's Plays.
Hmm.
But yeah, Winter Eye Game Studios is sort of our creative clearinghouse for making those, as well as reviews and little challenge episodes where we all decide to play a game and just sort of classic arcade style high score wins. Um, but it is also the vehicle through which we do the academic panel lectures. So trips to Too Many Games, Retro World Expo, Too Many Games last year, actually, I guess 2019. We did a talk on the history of the RPG genre, like where it got its starts. Going all the way back to Chaturanga and sort of the migration of chess from India westward
Oh,
through
wow.
the Middle East up into Morocco, and then Spain, where it kind of got codified a little bit more into sort of the those Staunton pieces, traditional chess that we understand it, and how it eventually became a sport in the 19th century, and how chess inspires things like H.G. Wells's Little Wars, which gets all our miniature tabletop gaming, sort of your Warhammer style play, right? And that the movement and wargaming of that style inspires um, chainmail, which gets Gygax and Arneson making Dungeons and Dragons, And obviously that kicks off a whole wave of attempting to clone the D&D experience in digital form, which leads to games being made in mainframes and early CRPGs in the West. And then the attempt to sort of reproduce those experiences, but to put different spins on them, kind of forms the kind of codifies the JRPG, and that kind of spins off into its own thing. And obviously that becomes such a big cultural influence that the mechanical and visual changes there kind of wash back westward later, and inspire sort of the modern
The cultural exchanges that
yeah, sort of the back and
inevitably
forth.
change our designs,
Yeah.
whether it's game design or how movies or books or whatnot. That's really interesting. I
So,
did not know you guys were at Too Many Games. I was at that convention too. I'll have to, if you're doing another panel when they inevitably start up again, I
well,
will
they
catch.
are, I think, October this year,
Mhm.
and I've already been in touch with them, so we will see. I mean, that's one we've been doing a talk at every year since 2016. Um, Too Many Games is I'd say, it's not the closest convention to me, but it's the one that probably means the most that I get out to every year. However, I have a big life thing happening in August that is going to slightly complicate getting up to Philadelphia in October.
Only slightly big.
Only
Yeah.
slightly, yeah. My wife and I are expecting our first little baby boy in August. So
That's awesome, man. I mean, congratulations again. I told you off mic, but seriously, congratulations. I said it before. I'm a dad now too. It's a lot of fun. It's exhausting, but it's a lot of fun. I do hope you make it up though, because I love Too Many Games is my favorite convention. It's also like the closest one to me, so I always try to go. But in the same line as that, like I used to go all 3 days. I would spend the entire weekend at Too Many Games.
mhm,
I can't do that this year. At least not this year. Maybe as my kid gets older, I could maybe bring them and go for the full weekend. But as of
right.
this year, I'm only going to be able to go one day, which sucks, but I get it at the same time. So it's Winter Ion, not Winterion.
It was originally designed to be Winter Ion. The
Okay.
inspiration for Winter Ion Game Studios was actually, I grew up in Clifton, Virginia. It is a small, isolated town surrounded by Northern Virginia, which is this incredibly built up, modern, suburban area with extremely, tech heavy, uh, very educated. It's kind of it gentrified very heavily starting in the 1990s. But Clifton is this little isolated. All the houses are separated by like 5 acres. You're nestled in the middle of woods. So I kind of grew up in this weirdly isolated, idyllic place. And when it would snow, those snow days where you would sit there, turn on cable access TV and just watch the ticker at the bottom and hope that your county was closed for the day.
Oh, I miss that.
And the
Sort of.
feeling sort of that having the eye on the ticker and waiting for it to say that you had the day off, and knowing that kid me was going to be able to fire up, at that point it was stuff like I was playing Mystic Quest on the Super Nintendo, or whatever, Sim
Yeah.
City, Civilization, whatever I felt like playing that day. Just the whole day opened up to me. So in this sort of weirdly ironic not going to school thing, I kind of got inspired by the feeling of like the potential of the snow day, and what it meant for like young gamer that suddenly had 8 hours. Because I lived too far away to go out and play in the snow with friends. Like, yeah, I could go outside and sled for a little bit on my own, but if it was, treacherous outside and it wasn't like people are going to come over, a snow day was basically for me was this chance to just have a beautiful picture outside my window and whatever game I felt like losing myself in that day. And sort of that feeling, that internalized sort of the joy that comes from um, just playing and relaxing and kind of losing yourself in the game at a time when you didn't necessarily expect you were going to get to do it. There's sort of that weird catharsis that comes from it.
You're
So it
making me
was Winter
nostalgic.
Ion, and that's why it's the digital snowflake is the logo, and it's kind of where that all comes from. But yeah, like the Winterion thing, I think maybe Game of Thrones is to blame. But a lot of people, when they read it, they naturally read it as Winterion. And so I've always just kind of run with however people feel like saying it, by all means.
That's
The
really
fact that
cool.
anyone's saying it at all is a compliment enough.
I actually remembered, just in speaking of your videos on Winter Ion as well. I just remembered one of the things I was also gonna kind of like talk about was I really liked that idea that you mentioned before the video of looking at the history of RPGs and JRPGs and tracing it all the way back to chess. I was not expecting for the panel you did at Too Many, was it Too Many Games? Yeah, Too
Yeah,
Many
too many
Games.
games.
I was not expecting you to go back that far. So like, what type like how do you, when you are approaching a topic, whether it's about design philosophies or whether it's like a history thing, like how do you research it? Because it's always something that I have an idea that I can tell you afterwards,
Sure.
that I'll tell you off mic, but that for a series that I want to do, but I not 100% sure how to really approach it.
Um, I mean, obviously, first party sources are your best bet. If you can talk to people that were in the room, developers, or if they have their oral histories, if they've recorded it anywhere, always start there if you can. The next best thing you can do is try to find people who have done some solid research already. One of my favorite authors that I've gone back to a couple times, and I use one of his class books in one of my classes, is Tristan Donovan,
Okay.
who wrote Replay, which is a great book on the history of video games. He wrote It's All a Game, which is a great book on the history of some famous board games. And Fizz, which is a book about soda. So he's got sort of a lot of my favorite interests all wrapped up in this. So he's an author I like to go to when I have the chance. But there's also incredible archival stuff that you can find if you're willing to dig. The Internet Archive
Hmm.
has amazing historical records. The people at the Video Game History Foundation have been doing yeoman work, cataloging a lot of ephemera related to games. There's definitely enough out there that I think in that first 50-year window of video games, you can find most of what you're looking for. You can ask for some of it too. We're lucky enough that some of the people that worked on this stuff are still around. I did an article for Retroware back in March about the history of Don Philip Gibson's Monopoly, that
Okay.
went back into his. Don was a family doctor in this tiny town, Winfield, Kansas, and he learned to teach. He taught himself to code in Turbo Pascal so that he could make software for his patients.
Oh,
Because
okay.
it's a small, family practice. You can't afford to go buy like a big expensive, medical software to run to keep patient records. So he taught himself to code in Turbo Pascal, and the way he taught himself to code was write a Monopoly game.
Hmm.
And his Monopoly game got released, and it kind of caught on fire. It was downloadable on bulletin boards. It became a very famous DOS version of the game. He eventually got a cease and desist for it. He had like thousands of fan letters that were written by folks that had sent them to him,
Wow.
talking about how much they loved playing his game. He had a letter from Steve Martin,
What?
talking about like they would play it offset. So he had really influenced a ton of people, and it was a really neat thing for me to dig into there, because we tend to think of game designers as people like for whom that is their characteristic. Like we think of them as a game designer first, and they happen to maybe be interested in other hobbies or whatever. It's very rare that we're like, oh, well, here's someone who was a church organist for 50 years. He was the beloved like family doctor in town. He
Wow.
just happened to be interested in programming and made a game, not for the purposes of making the game so much, but really just because it was a teaching tool for him, and that happened to be the thing that sparked this kind of love for a game that very rarely gets defined for being something that brings people together. Monopoly is typically the thing we always joke about as
Yeah,
tearing people
destroys
apart, right?
families. Yeah.
But this is a weird thing that brought people like this joy tangibly, and sent him this documented evidence of it. So when I wrote that, I was absolutely digging through, whatever. I talked to the Cowley County Historical Society and the people in town there that could give firsthand accounts of, how much Don meant to their community, his family members, his kids and his grandkids. If you are willing to do the legwork, you can really learn a lot about games and design through the lenses of the people who make them. They are still creative works. Their creators are important. You mentioned the Too Many Games panel. Obviously, chess is extremely well
Yeah.
recorded. For a panel like that, it's really about walking backwards and understanding. Okay, how did we get from, here to here? Let's take the 10-year step. What did it take to get to Dragon Quest?
And drawing parallels from what came before, like
Right.
this,
And
they grabbed this from this, and then what did that grab that from,
right.
type of thing.
So you can see the pieces of that coming from the work before it, and the work before that, and the work before that. And sometimes you can find developer interviews, or sometimes developers have talked about what inspired them. A lot of artists love to give credit to the thing that kind of like, well, I was a big fan of blog growing up, right? That's the line you'll always hear when people talk about making games. And so you can kind of traverse that line backwards, both in sort of seeing what inspired or developed a mechanic versus what kind of kicked off a new idea. And it's just a matter of putting that timeline together in a way that is both cohesive, easy to follow for the listener or
Creating
the
a story
viewer.
around the timeline almost.
Right. Yeah. And being able to make that in a presentable way, and then also being able to distill that argument into a time format. When you're in YouTube, you have, I think it's like, what, 4 minutes to really capture, like maybe even less than 4 minutes to capture the attention of the viewer. And if you go longer than 15 minutes, you're already like in trouble of holding on, like retention numbers drop. It's a very unique format. Whereas with the panel lectures, we can go 45 minutes to an hour in that discussion, and you can get a little deeper, a little more nuanced in what you talk about. So there is sort of a difference in your format, your location, and what you tackle.
I think that's why I like podcasting so much, because in general, people will listen to the episodes longer than they would on a YouTube video. Because YouTube video, you have to be doing just that. Like you have to be watching the video in order to. I mean, not necessarily, but in general, you have to be watching the video to
Mhm.
take in that entertainment. Versus podcasts, you can be doing that while you're doing other stuff. You could be doing the
Yeah.
laundry, you could be driving to work, you could be at work listening to it while you're working, type of
Shout
thing.
out to all the people listening to this at work.
Yeah. Thank you all for downloading. Seriously, you're all the rock stars. Actually, that's where I listen to most of the podcasts that I do. And actually, that's a perfect segue to my next question for you. Since you are a content creator, what are some of your favorite content creators that you see in the gaming space, retro, modern, or otherwise?
So I don't know that I have the widest net when it comes to this stuff. A lot of the people I know are people I have met at conventions, become friends with through, doing this. I actually started writing with Pat Contry
Hmm.
years ago for his Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES
I
library.
actually have that book right now.
Yeah,
I'm
so
looking at it.
I spent probably 2 years writing for that. And so, I became friends with sort of a social circle of people surround, in that group, like the writers. And then I reached out and did a panel with Shane Lewis from Rerez.
Hmm.
We did a Sega hardware retrospective a few years ago at Too Many Games. So I,
I might have
stay in
seen that
contact with
one.
them. And I did a panel at Retro World Expo with Norm Caruso, gaming historian,
Hmm.
Leonard Herman, who had written the Phoenix
Yes, that's one of the
series of books.
earliest books of video game history.
Yeah, Leonard is a font of knowledge, and that's another. Getting back to sort of where do you go for information? His is a treasure trove of that stuff. The fourth edition of that book is really something
I've been
special.
meaning to pick up a copy of that, but it's a little out of my price range right now. It's
Yeah,
worth it. Like I'm not. I totally get why
there,
it's so
yeah,
pricey. It's huge,
there
but
are like critical works. Like I always tell people, one of the books that really got me through my thesis for the parallels between games and opera was the definitive Kobe's opera guide. Because it's one of those books where the author clearly had command of everything he was talking about, but still managed to distill it in a way that was great for research, and you could just kind of find what you were looking for. So in the same way, there are books that you can find in game history that are sort of accurate. You can find ones that they will perpetuate little things like the 100 yen shortage thing with Space Invaders, and is that true? Some books will tell you it's 100% true. Some books will tell you it's a complete fabrication. Some will say, well, there were some questions about whether the coin shortage was related to that or other factors, but it is kind of a thing that was reached out and talked about, and maybe it happened. But when you really find books that can give you peer reviewed and well researched information on just a bevy of topics, you hold on to those. They make their way to your shelf.
I need to finish reading it. I'm friends with an author named Patrick Hickey Jr. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he interviews game devs and he has them kind of tell their story of it. So he has a series of books called The Minds Behind the Games, where it's just a series of interviews with game devs about the games they've worked on. And it's kind of written like a 30 for 30, like an ESPN 30 for 30 style kind of. So it's a he like he'll tell like their story while also interspersing quotes from the interview, so that way you kind of get an idea of like what they went through. Like he interviewed the one guy who created Night Trap for the Sega CD,
Hmm.
right? And it was talking about like one of the things that blew my mind was after all the the chaos that game ensued, with the ESRB that resulted in the creation of the
Right, the
ESRB and
Lieberman
whatnot.
Cole hearings, yeah.
Exactly. His girlfriend left him because of that, because of all of that stuff, because of the stigma related to that game.
Mhm.
He got dumped, which I thought was like a really like that. I thought that was interesting personally.
Yeah,
Like that's just a
again,
weird
there's
thing.
just no alternative for first party sources. I mean,
Yeah.
if you have the opportunity, and this is something we kind of talk like right now about being in this golden age of preservation. Like I think the sphere, the interest in it is reaching a fever pitch. We always hear that the horror stories about how many early films were lost
Mm-hmm.
because of the
Mm-hmm.
lack of preservation efforts, and we're doing a terrific job already. I mean, just not everything, but just about everything is dumped at this point, right? Like we're doing a great job preserving the code of games, but not the source code, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's something we're missing out. But like the executable code of games we've got, we're doing a decent job. People are getting a little better about scanning manuals and some of the smaller ephemera about games, things that are easier to digitize. Frank Cifaldi is again just I can't say enough good about what he and Kelsey are doing with VGHF.
I loved his talks at GDC. I love both his talk. I've watched both his talks at GDC multiple times, and of
Yeah.
course, listened to him on Retronauts, and I love the stuff they do.
But now that I guess the next question is, what's the stuff that we aren't necessarily doing as good a job preserving? And
Mm-hmm.
it's oral histories, right? Actually talking to developers and getting their stories and their perspectives. I'm reaching out to two right now, actually, for two separate articles that I intend to write in the future. It's getting history and information behind the developers and the publishers and some of the inside baseball stuff that isn't necessarily well documented. We had the good fortune years ago. Nolan Bushnell was actually a game pioneer in residence at Mason for a while, and
Oh, okay.
I had the chance to sit and just talk with him for a couple hours over drinks, at a hotel bar, and get some of the skinny of what was going on. What was day to day operative life like for Atari in 1976 or 77?
Probably lots of cocaine.
It was wild, but not like in the ways you would necessarily expect.
Yeah,
Like, the pizza parties on Fridays if they hit their sales quotes, or sort of the experience of going from trying to make these machines to figuring out that, hey, it costs us $300 to make a machine and we get $350 back in the first like 2 weeks of operation. So basically, we can't hire people fast enough to build these things because they're turning a profit in less than a month.
that's
Um,
crazy. Wow.
and just sort of living through that weird explosion of exponential growth in a product line, and trying to turn an operation into orders of magnitude larger than it was. But yeah, like if you can get from the people there and then a sense of what was going on and get that down somewhere, that's the stuff that's going to stick for decades and decades to come.
I that's honestly one of my personal goals for this podcast, is not to do that solely, but to have episodes where I can document stuff like that. Like it's not necessarily for, not just for the sake of game preservation, but also just I want to interview cool people, I think it'd be fun. So it's something that's a goal of mine to do more of that. And like you said, it's something that needs to be worked on. And I'm not even saying this for me. Like Pat Hickey's Jr.'s book, like he has a whole series and he's interviewing tons and tons of game dev. So if that's something you're interested in, man, I definitely suggest checking out his books. He's a good guy to talk to too. He's really nice. He's an Islanders fan, so you're gonna have to forgive him of that. But
He's not going to be happy with me tonight, though. I
are,
think it was what 6-3 Caps.
did the Caps win tonight? 6-3.
Yes, I think it's second straight. They're currently playing in a 3-game series, Caps and Islanders. And being a DC native, I didn't actually start out a Washington Capitals fan. When I was growing up, my favorite player was actually Raymond Bourque.
Okay.
So I rooted for the Bruins until he went to the Avalanche. I cried like a baby when he won the cup, and Gary Thorne goes in after 22 years, Raymond Bourque, and it's at home, Game 7. Devils and Avalanche, and one of the most amazing. Marty Brodeur and Patrick Waugh, like the height of their powers, just star-studded rosters on both sides. That 2001 Cup final, was just unreal. And then I just kind of watched hockey for a while until his son Chris Bourque entered the draft. And I said, well, I'll root for whoever Chris ends up getting drafted by. And he gets drafted by the hometown team, the Washington Capitals, in the same year that they draft some Russian guy, Alexander something.
What? The grade 8. What's his name?
Yeah, yeah. And so obviously, as I might be the only person who ever bought a Chris Bourque Caps jersey. My apologies to the rest of the Bourque family. But it was kind of fun. Like he never really made the show here in the NHL.
It
But
happens.
it was kind of a great time to accidentally end up on the Caps bandwagon, because the time spent at this point, you're just appreciating what's happened, not just the fact that he managed to bring a cup to a team that seemed eternally cursed to never have a Stanley
He
Cup to
had
their
so
name.
many times, and it
You
just
know,
I was happy I was rooting for the Caps when they won the cup that year.
But just kind of the experience of getting to enjoy the Caps in the Ovechkin era has been unreal. And like, I guess any fan of a team that has like a window where things just kind of work well, I feel like you can't be a fan of, I don't know, the Pittsburgh Steelers and not look back fondly on the 70s,
Yeah.
or be a fan of the Montreal Canadiens and not think about the days when you basically got to draft all the best players because you had first pick anyone that came out of Quebec, which meant they ran off and won, whatever, 17,000 Stanley Cups in the old days. So yeah, it's funny and odd. Like, I think a lot of people have the experience of being a fan of a sports franchise because their family brings them into it. My grandfather on my dad's side, was a born raised Yankees fan, and my whole father's side, they were all from New York. Everybody on the Greenbergs, they're all New Yorkers, and so I was raised listening to Yankees games on the porch on the radio. I still to this day, for me, listening to baseball on the radio is sort of the way I consume the sport. I like, I'll watch
Oh,
it on
okay.
TV, but I grew up listening to it on the radio, and so the experience of being a fan of that team is thinking about the legacy. With the hockey has always been my favorite sport, really. The experience of living during your team's greatest period. Now, granted, they've only been around since 1974, and it's great to pretend that first season never
Huh.
happened.
That was actually
Um,
the first year the Flyers won the cup, and hasn't really won much since. They won those two
yeah,
in
they I
the
was gonna say they
mid
won two
70s.
years in a row, and then that was it.
That
Or
was it. They
yeah,
came close a handful of times, but never made it. They got to the finals a couple times in the 80s, but ran into the Edmonton Oilers dynasty, and then they got to the next time they really pushed was with Lindros in the 90s. They ran
and that
into the
was
Red
the
Wings
Red Wings
dynasty,
juggernaut. Yeah,
and then they got to it again in 2010 and ran into the Blackhawks dynasty. So it just
so
happens. They just happen to meet these
peaking at the wrong time. Yeah.
dynasty teams. Yeah.
And it's one of those things where the Caps, it was the opposite thing. They battled through in, I think, '98. They had one of the weirdestly, easy. I think they had the Buffalo Sabres in the Eastern Conference Finals. They had kind of an oddly easy road through that year, only to get obliterated by the Wings. I think that was actually the year after the Flyers, or maybe 2 years
Okay.
after. But it was like where I think the Red Wings won consecutive 4-0 Stanley Cups, and I think that was the Flyers and Caps maybe in '97, '98,
Wow. Wow. I didn't know
where
that.
it was just like they were so much better than everybody else. Um,
Yeah.
but the experience of living at the time that your franchise is in sort of its peak window is very cool, and I wouldn't trade it for any other sports fandom thing.
All right. So I only have a couple more questions for you for us to wrap this up.
Yeah.
So this it's specific, actually, just one question, and I've been trying to do this more frequently. It's questions from Courtney. Courtney is my wife, and I always tell her, like, I'm having this person on the podcast, and she never knows she's not into gaming. She's not into a lot of the geeky stuff that I am. So it's fun though, because that means she asks questions that I would never ask. Uh, so her question that she wanted me to ask you, knowing nothing about you, is when you were in high school, which actually it's kind of funny that she asked this specifically after you told me you dropped out of high school. But what did you do in between classes during high school? And then there wasn't much there, what about after high school? Did you go straight to homework or did you relax?
No, it's a good question. Um, so I dropped out of high school in 1999, but in that time period, I the first thing I did was I lawyered up. I basically sent a letter to Fairfax County saying, it's my intention to no longer attend school. I'm going to be ordering correspondence courses through, so and so program. If you have any questions about this, my attorney's number is so and so. Have a good day, my name. And I think that, like, the fact that I wrote such a coherent form letter, and had my counsel attached to it and everything. Normally, obviously, they're going to go after you for that. I think they took one look at that and was like, okay, this kid's serious. Let's leave him alone. I spent maybe 2 weeks a semester actually doing high school work. I would sit there and do all the packets and kind of write up everything I needed to write up and seal it up and hold on to it for 4 months and then mail it to the school at the end of that 4 month window, get my grades, and then do my next classes. So I was technically, in high school, but not really. It was just kind of a thing to
Yeah.
going through the paces. I worked. So I got my first job at a mom and pop game store called Game Parlor in Chantilly, Virginia.
Okay.
And Game Parlor was a sanctuary. It was an experience where when you worked there, everyone that came into the store, and this is something that people in retail will tell you, if you've ever worked in retail,
I have.
um, what kind of retail you work in makes such a huge difference. And Game Parlor was a place where everyone who came into it wanted to be there. They were people who were off of work for the day, or they were coming in to play in a Magic the Gathering tournament, or to play in their weekly D&D game. Game Parlor sold everything: board games, card games, um, materials for people who played, like, war games. They had the complete Games Workshop line of Warhammer stuff,
Okay.
comic books, trade paperbacks, miniatures, painting materials, and supplies. They had about 11 tables that people could sit down and play at, and another four, like, big 5x10 tables for wargaming. So it was kind of a sanctuary for tabletop gaming, and it was something that kind of rekindled my interest in games, because after I'd kind of dropped out of high school, I wasn't playing a ton of video games at that point, but it sort of gave me a window back into it. And the owner there, 4 days after I started as their janitor, saw me messing around with. They had an 8 computer LAN. Really dating myself here. You could go in and, like,
God, I miss
do
LAN
LAN
parties.
parties, and we would sit and play Counter Strike till like 2 in the morning.
Yeah.
But I was in there and I had to do some registry editing, I think, to get X-Wing versus TIE Fighter to work correctly on the network. I was doing something, and all he just comes in and sees all of this hex code all over the screen. He goes, what are you doing? It's like, well, there's this stupid thing you have to fix in the registry to get X-Wing TIE Fighter to stop crashing. And he's like, well, why are you my janitor? And says, why don't you work on my website, and you can still clean the store for 2 hours a day, but then I want you to handle, like, our online portal and, like, helping people sign up to run events here. And taught me, like, to work on the registers, and the register software back then. He had old register software, and so it was written in COBOL. So, like, we had to learn a little bit of COBOL programming if we wanted to add, like, a loyalty point system to for our customers to get a
Hmm.
discount on stuff.
Hmm.
And he's the one who pushed me to go to college. And I went from high school dropout to college professor in very no small part because of that job there at Game
That's
Parlor.
so cool.
And so my time between classes in high school, I would say, is basically um, being a full-time employee slash customer of maybe the best traditional game store to have ever been operated.
That's awesome. Uh, I was not expecting that story out of that question, but that was, I think, one of the best answers I've ever gotten. That's really cool. Um, I got nothing else for you, man. This was one of the most fun interviews I've had in a while. I also loved how like we talked about game design in a more like detailed and more in-depth way. That was a lot of fun for me because I love game design, and it was something I learned very quickly that I am not necessarily the greatest at making games because I don't have the determination to do it, but I love talking about it. So this has been a lot of fun for me. So thank you so much for joining me on this episode, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. I'm really easy to get a hold of. I tend to be on Twitter a little too much at Winter Ion. You can find all the video stuff we're doing at watch.winterion.com. And then if you are interested and you happen to have the wherewithal to sign up, George Mason University's computer game design program is at game.gmu.edu. You can find more stuff about us there.
As for me, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StillLoadingPod on all of them. If you want to reach out, you can contact me at stillloadingcontact@gmail.com or any of the social media handles I mentioned. If you want to support the show, you can do that in a number of ways. Probably the easiest is to give it a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or whichever podcasting app you use. Or if you want to support it financially, go to patreon.com/stillloadingpod. Even just $1 a month will help grow the show. I keep forgetting this. I also stream on Twitch. If you want to hang out, I've been trying to stream more frequently on Twitch, so feel free to hang. It's Still Loading Pod on Twitch, so feel free to follow me over there. And the most important shout out I have is the Bit by Bit Foundation. The Bit by Bit Foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to put video games and video game consoles in the hands of children receiving inpatient care at hospitals. So if you want to support them, go to bitbybitfoundation.org and consider donating. And that is all I have for you for this episode of Still Loading. Dan, thanks once again for joining me. I know I thanked you a bunch of times, but seriously, this was a lot of fun.
Likewise. Thanks for having me on.
And I will see you all next time.